He knocked off the old plaster and heard the clang of metal. Behind the wall was a secret entrance, hidden for decades. But what the builder saw behind the door was better left undiscovered. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The road that led to the estate was barely a road at all, more a path cut through the undergrowth by stubborn insistence than by any real design. Trees leaned close on either side, their branches knotting together overhead so that the afternoon light filtered down in fragmented shafts, gilding the dirt track with shifting patterns. The old truck rattled as it went, its shocks groaning in protest each time a wheel struck one of the deep ruts left by years of neglect. Roots bulged through the earth like veins, thick and unyielding, forcing the vehicle to lurch and shudder. Dust rose behind in a pale plume, vanishing quickly in the damp, heavy air. At the wheel sat Andrew Hale, a man whose life had been measured in the weight of bricks and mortar, in the careful line of a beam and the echo of his hammer against stone. He was in his 50s now, the sort of man whose skin bore the etching of decades spent beneath the sun, whose hands were mapped with scars from nails and blades. His hair was flecked with gray, and his shoulders stooped slightly from the years of labor. He had been many things: husband, father, builder, repairman. But he thought of himself most simply as a man who understood the language of walls. To him, every structure whispered its story. Some carried pride, others resignation. Some offered warmth, and many more were heavy with secrets. This job had come not from his usual channels, but through a wealthy businessman who had bought an abandoned mansion on the edge of town. The place, Andrew was told, had been empty for half a century, left to sag into ruin while vines strangled its walls and trees clawed through the foundations. The new owner wanted it restored, though no one seemed able to say exactly why. The contract was large, larger than Andrew had taken in years, and the money promised would ease the burden that hung heavy on him: college tuition for his son, hospital bills left unpaid after his wife's passing. He had agreed without much hesitation, though even as he drove the last miles to the property, unease gathered like mist in the back of his mind. The truck broke free of the narrow lane and rattled into a clearing. The mansion rose ahead, looming in a way that made Andrew instinctively tighten his grip on the wheel. It was vast, built of heavy stone blocks that bore the cracks of weather and age. The roof sagged beneath a carpet of moss that spread like a shroud, and the windows, what remained of them, were boarded up, the wood blackened and warped. From a distance it seemed blind, its eyes covered, its mouth sealed shut. Even in daylight, the house gave the impression of something waiting, something holding its breath. Andrew cut the engine and let the silence settle. Only then did he notice how strange the air was here. Damp and sour, thick with the smell of mold and rotting leaves. It clung to his clothes, heavy in his lungs. He stepped out, his boots crunching against gravel that had once been a drive, now split and twisted with roots. Statues dotted the grounds, angels with eroded faces and mythic figures whose marble limbs had been captured mid-motion before time had stolen their details. Ivy wrapped around their bodies, as though nature sought to bind them, to erase them slowly from memory. He walked a slow circuit around the exterior, noting the cracked masonry, the warped shutters, the sagging gutters. It was work he understood, tasks he could number in his head. But as he looked up at the blackened boards nailed across the windows, he felt the uncanny prick of being watched from behind them. He forced the thought away and returned to the truck, unloading his tools. Work, he told himself, was the one honest thing he had ever known. If he lost himself in the rhythm of it, the house would seem no different than any other. Inside, the air was cooler, but it reeked of mildew and dust. The great hall opened before him, its high ceiling dark with age, its floor littered with broken furniture and splinters of glass. Cobwebs drooped from the corners like forgotten curtains. His footsteps echoed back to him with unnerving immediacy, the sound too sharp, as though the space were smaller than it appeared. He lit a lantern, its glow pushing the shadows back only reluctantly, and set to work. His task for the day was to strip the plaster from one of the main walls in the hall. The owner wanted the original stone revealed, a fashion that had grown popular in the restoration circles, the rugged honesty of old masonry displayed rather than hidden. Andrew prepared his chisel and hammer and began. The first blow sent dust puffing into the air, the chalky fragments falling to the ground in dull showers. He worked methodically, a rhythm of strike and scrape, the kind of labor that could lull the mind into quiet. But not here. Not in this house. Each strike seemed to echo too loudly, reverberating in his chest. The walls answered him in tones he did not recognize. The plaster came away easily in some places, but in others it clung stubbornly, as though the wall did not wish to be uncovered. Sweat gathered on his brow, rolling down into his eyes, and he paused to wipe it away. That was when he noticed it, a difference in sound. The hammer rang sharper, colder, as if it had struck metal rather than stone. Andrew froze, the tool still in his hand. Slowly, he chipped away more plaster around the spot, revealing beneath it a surface that did not belong. It was dark, flaking with rust, rough beneath his fingertips when he brushed away the dust. At first he thought it might be some forgotten reinforcement beam, but as he cleared more, he saw the edges begin to take shape. Straight lines, right angles, the faint curve of an iron plate. His pulse quickened. He stepped back, lantern held high. The glow caught the glint of a corroded lock, swollen and cracked with age. The truth pressed against him with sudden weight. It was not a beam, not a brace. It was a door. For a long moment he simply stood there, listening to the silence that seemed to swell around him. His breath sounded loud, too loud, and the lantern flickered, as though disturbed by a draft, though he felt no wind. A door, hidden beneath decades of plaster and paint, set not into an arch or frame, but into the wall itself. It made no sense. Andrew's hand trembled slightly as he touched the surface again. The iron was cold, colder than it should have been in the still air of the hall. Flakes of rust clung to his fingers. He imagined the men who had built it, the hands that had laid the stone around it, the minds that had decided it must be concealed. Why would anyone build a door here? And where could it possibly lead? He did not yet know, but in that moment, standing in the dusty hall of a house that felt more alive than dead, Andrew Hale realized one thing with absolute clarity. He had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. And though the thought unsettled him, he also knew with a kind of grim certainty that he would not be able to leave it alone. Andrew did not sleep well the night after he first uncovered the iron surface beneath the plaster. He had returned home with dust in his hair and rust stains on his hands. But even after washing, the image clung to him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw again the glint of corroded metal, the suggestion of a lock half buried in the wall. The silence of the house lingered too, that uncanny hush that had fallen when his hammer struck the plate. He told himself it was simply the shock of discovery, the mind lingering on the unusual. Yet when the hours dragged on, and dawn arrived without true rest, he knew the unease was something deeper. He rose before the sun, pulling on the same work clothes, still marked by yesterday's labor, and drove back to the estate. The road was no friendlier in the early light. Dew slicked the branches overhead, and the mist lay thick between the trees. The mansion loomed when he arrived, its boards blackened, its roof hunched like a beast waiting to spring. He parked by the gate and walked through the wet grass, his boots soaking almost immediately. The statue seemed different in the dawn, Where the night had cast them into obscurity, the pale light now revealed their faces clearly, and in their expressionless gazes, he thought he saw a kind of rebuke, as if they disapproved of what he had begun to reveal. Inside, the air was colder than the morning chill outside. He returned to the hall where the iron door waited, its surface now fully exposed. With the plaster stripped away, the outline was impossible to mistake. Nearly 6 feet wide, 4 high, a slab of iron framed directly into the wall, with hinges so large he could not imagine how they had ever been mounted. The lock was a swollen cylinder of corroded steel, fused shut by years of moisture. Andrew crouched before it, running his hand along the edges. The metal was rough and sharp where it had split, but beneath the corrosion he felt solidity, strength. This door had been made to endure. Yet the question pressed against him with a weight he could not shake. Where did it lead? He took out the folded papers he kept in his work bag, the blueprints and surveys the new owner had provided. Kneeling on the dusty floor, he spread them out and traced the lines with a calloused finger. The wall in which the door was embedded was marked as an exterior wall, solid stone, with nothing beyond it but open ground. He frowned and went outside, circling the house to that very spot. The wall rose sheer and plain, its surface weathered, but intact. Behind it stretched only the overgrown garden, a tangle of bushes and wild vines that reached nearly to his chest. He pushed through the foliage to press his palm against the stone. Solid. Cold. No hint of a door. Logic unraveled in his mind. If the blueprints were true, if his own eyes were not deceived, then the door he had found could not exist. It should not have been there at all. The thought gnawed at him as he stood among the bushes, damp leaves brushing against his arms, the smell of soil heavy in the air. The house seemed to loom above, watching him as he puzzled over its contradiction. He told himself again that old buildings often carried surprises, hidden cellars, forgotten spaces. But even as he thought it, he knew this was something else. A door built to lead nowhere was not an oversight. It was deliberate. The unease that had followed him from the first day deepened. He began to notice small things he might have dismissed before. At night, when he lay down in the narrow bed of his rented room, he heard faint sounds, carried on the wind. Creaks, scrapes, almost like the slow movement of hinges. Once, he woke to the clear impression that someone had knocked, softly, insistently, from the other side of his wall. He told himself it was only a dream, but when he rose in the morning, his tools were not where he had left them. The hammer rested a foot away from its place. The chisel was tilted against the wall, at an angle he would never have set. His rational mind searched for reasons, fatigue, distraction, some slip of memory. Yet the explanations felt thin. By the second week, the iron door consumed his thoughts. He tried to busy himself with other work repairing the staircase, clearing debris from the upper floors, but no matter where he went in the house, his mind circled back to the hall. He felt its presence even when he was far from it, a weight at the edge of his awareness, as if the house itself carried tension around that hidden place. The silence there was different, louder, waiting. He told no one of his discovery. The owner might order it sealed again, might decide the curiosity was too costly or unnecessary. Andrew feared not dismissal, but the possibility that he would be denied the chance to know. A part of him recoiled at the thought of entering, yet another part, stronger, insistent, demanded that he find out what lay beyond. Secrets were buried here, and he had already unearthed too much to turn back. One morning he returned to the hall with deliberate intent. Dust hung in the air like smoke as he raised his lantern and studied the door again. The rust seemed deeper now, the corrosion more vivid in the wavering light. He set down his bag and fetched the heavy crowbar he kept for stubborn beams. Its steel glinted dully, worn from years of use. He tested its weight in his hand, then knelt by the lock. His breath echoed in the cavernous hall, steady and slow, as he fit the tip into the swollen seam. He hesitated. A man could still walk away. He could plaster the wall again, forget what he had found, and leave the house to its silence. Yet he knew, with the certainty of one who has lived too long to lie to himself, that he would not. The door called to him, not with voice or movement, but with the undeniable gravity of a secret long hidden. Andrew pressed down on the bar. The lock groaned, a metallic protest that reverberated through the stones. Rust flaked away, drifting like ash to the floor. He braced himself and forced the bar harder. The sound rose, sharper now, until with a final wrench it snapped, the crack ringing like a bone breaking. He froze, crowbar still in hand, as silence rushed back to fill the space. The hall seemed to recoil, every shadow stretched taut. He waited, breath shallow, but nothing came. The door stood still, its surface scarred, but its secret intact. Yet the lock was broken. The barrier between him and the unknown had fractured, and there could be no repair. Andrew rose slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He felt the tremor in his arms, not only from exertion but from the weight of what he had done. The path was chosen now. Whether he willed it or not, he had taken the first step. The iron door, mute and massive, waited, and Andrew Hale knew, with a dread as cold as the rust beneath his fingers, that soon he would have to open it. For days after he broke the lock, Andrew found himself circling the mansion like a restless animal, unable to stay away from the hall where the iron door stood waiting. He forced himself to carry on with other tasks, replacing floorboards that had rotted through on the upper levels, repairing the fractured banister along the grand staircase, clearing debris from the ruined library where books had dissolved into mildew. But none of it held his focus. Every nail he drove, every board he cut, was accompanied by the unyielding presence of that hidden door. It loomed in his thoughts as though it were alive, drawing him back again and again. At night, when he tried to rest, he would see it in his dreams. Sometimes it was closed, the rusted surface glistening in the light of his lantern, the broken lock hanging like a severed limb. Other times it was open, and in the dream he would walk forward without choice, pulled into darkness that stretched endlessly before him. He would wake sweating, his heart racing, certain that he had heard the groan of hinges in the silence of his room. He told himself it was imagination, the tricks of fatigue, and an old man's mind grown weary. But when he returned to the mansion each morning, he always checked the door to be sure it had not shifted. It never had. Yet the sense of waiting never left. By the end of the week, he knew he could not delay. The lock was broken. The secret would not rest. On a morning heavy with fog, Andrew arrived at the estate earlier than usual, carrying not only his tools, but a sturdy flashlight and a coil of rope. He had told no one what he intended. The thought of involving others seemed dangerous, not only because of what they might discover, but because of what they might decide to do. This was his discovery, and his burden. If there was danger waiting, it was his alone to face. Inside, the house greeted him with its familiar silence. He walked quickly through the hallways, past the dust-choked curtains and broken furniture, until at last he reached the great hall. There it was, as he had left it. The iron door, its edges eaten by rust, the shattered lock still lying in pieces on the floor. He stood before it for a long moment, listening to the thud of his own heartbeat. The air felt heavier here, as though the walls themselves anticipated what was to come. Andrew set down the rope, adjusted the flashlight in his hand, and took hold of the edge of the door. It resisted at first, the weight of years, and the stubborn clutch of vines and dust holding it in place. He braced himself and pulled harder. The hinges shrieked, the sound reverberating through the house like a cry of protest. Inch by inch the door shifted, until at last a narrow gap opened, spilling out a draft of air that was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of stone and decay. He coughed as it washed over him, a taste of mildew settling on his tongue. With a final heave, the door yielded, swinging wide enough for a man to pass. Beyond it, concrete steps descended into the earth. The beam of his flashlight pierced the darkness, illuminating slick walls streaked with moisture, the narrow passage descending steeply out of sight. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, each drop striking with unnatural clarity. For a long moment, Andrew stood at the threshold, every instinct in him screaming to turn back. This was not part of the house. This was something older, something other. Yet the pull was stronger than fear. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, adjusted the coil of rope around his shoulder, and stepped forward. The first step was firm beneath his boots, though slick with damp. The second seemed colder, the air heavier. With each step downward, the silence deepened, pressing close around him like a shroud. His breath echoed against the walls, the beam of his light quivering as his hand trembled slightly. He forced himself to steady, focusing on the concrete at his feet. The descent lasted longer than it should have. By the shape of the house, he should have already passed beneath the foundation. Yet still the steps continued, drawing him deeper into the earth. Cracks spidered across the walls, dark veins through which water seeped, dripping steadily. The air smelled of rust, mold, and something else, something acrid, chemical, that stung his nose and tightened his throat. At last the staircase leveled into a narrow corridor. The ceiling pressed low, the walls close enough that he had to keep his shoulders drawn in. He raised the flashlight, its beam sweeping across bare concrete, stained dark in places where moisture had gathered. The silence was so complete that he could hear the rasp of his own breath, the thud of his heart. Each step forward echoed as though magnified, swallowed instantly by the oppressive quiet. Then his light caught it. Another door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the iron slab above, this one was of thick steel, its surface scarred and pitted. Weld marks ran along its edges, dark and uneven, as if someone had sealed it with hurried desperation. The hinges sagged under the weight, and one corner hung slightly ajar. Through the gap came a stronger draft, colder than the air above, tinged with the unmistakable odor of dust and decay. Andrew approached slowly, every muscle in his body tense. His flashlight beam wavered as he lifted it, illuminating the jagged seam. He pressed his hand against the steel. The chill seeped instantly into his skin, deeper than any cold he had felt on the surface. It was the cold of stone that had never seen light, of secrets buried too long. He felt a tremor run through him, and for a moment he considered turning back, sealing the door once more and forgetting what he had found. But he could not. With a deep breath, he set his shoulder against the steel and pushed. The door groaned, a sound low and guttural like some ancient creature disturbed in its sleep. Rust flaked away, drifting into the beam of his light like ash. Inch by inch, the gap widened until the chamber beyond was revealed. Dust swirled in the stale air, disturbed for the first time in decades. The space was vast, larger than Andrew could have imagined, the walls stretching into shadows beyond the reach of his light. His footsteps echoed as he stepped inside, the sound hollow, swallowed by silence. The floor was littered with debris flakes of rust, scraps of paper too decayed to recognize, fragments of wood that crumbled beneath his boots. Rows of shelves lined the walls, their frames sagging under the weight of boxes and containers. Some were intact, sealed with brittle tape, their labels faded, but still legible in places. Dates from the 1960s. Numbers. Warnings stenciled in block letters. Others had collapsed, spilling their contents across the floor in heaps of yellowed paper and cracked plastic. Andrew's beam swept across one shelf, catching the corner of a box still sealed. His hand shook as he reached for it, tearing away the tape with a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. Inside were stacks of documents, neatly wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled one bundle free, untying the string with fumbling fingers. The papers within were brittle, the typewritten lines faded, but legible. Names, transactions, shipments. He did not recognize them, but the weight of secrecy clung to every page. These were not records meant for ordinary eyes. He set the papers back, his light moving on. A table stood nearby, covered in dust so thick it seemed like frost. On it lay a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels motionless, coated with decades of neglect. Beside it were stacks of tapes, each labeled with coded phrases and dates. Andrew imagined the voice of the man who had once sat here, recording instructions or confessions, and the thought unsettled him deeply. The room felt inhabited still, not by bodies, but by the ghosts of intent. Photographs were scattered among the papers, their edges curled and brittle. He picked one up, brushing away dust. The image showed men in suits shaking hands beside a crate. Another revealed soldiers standing before ships in harbor. Another, still, dark silhouettes of planes against a cloudy sky. Each picture seemed to hint at a larger story, fragments of some vast machinery hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. Andrew's light swept further, catching a partial wall at the far end of the chamber. An iron grate sealed it, its bars corroded, but intact. He approached, the sound of his footsteps echoing strangely, as though the room resented his presence. With effort, he pulled at the grate. The hinges screeched, loud and harsh, before giving way. Beyond was another chamber, smaller, but its shelves were lined with metallic canisters. Symbols were painted on their sides, hazard diamonds, skulls, strange markings that prickled his memory. Some of the containers were intact, their seals unbroken. Others bore signs of corrosion, streaks of dark residue running down their sides. From one, a viscous liquid dripped steadily, forming a stagnant pool on the floor that shimmered faintly in the light. The stench was immediate, acrid, burning his throat. He pulled his shirt over his mouth and nose, his stomach tightening with sudden fear. This was no mere cellar of forgotten supplies. This was an arsenal, a vault of poisons and secrets. He thought again of the welded seams on the door, the desperate attempt to lock this place away. Whoever had done so had not meant to keep intruders out. They had meant to keep something in. Andrew staggered back, his mind racing, the beam of his light darting across the endless rows of papers, the leaking canisters, the silent shelves that seemed to watch him. He realized then that by opening the door, by stepping inside, he had crossed a threshold not meant for men like him. He was no longer a builder, a repairman. He had become the unwilling guardian of something vast and dangerous, something that should have remained buried. The silence pressed close, broken only by the slow drip of the leaking container. The beam of his light flickered once, plunging the chamber into darkness for a breathless instant. In that moment, Andrew imagined he felt the past itself, leaning close, whispering in voices he could not understand. When the light steadied again, the room was unchanged, yet he knew with certainty that he was not. He stood in the heart of the hidden chamber, his breath ragged, the weight of discovery pressing down upon him. He had stepped beyond the threshold, and nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The chamber seemed to breathe with him as Andrew stood frozen among the shelves, the beam of his flashlight trembling against the concrete walls. He felt the silence pressing closer, heavy with an expectancy that made the hair on his arms rise. The smell of rust, mold, and chemical rot clung to him, filling his lungs until he could barely draw breath. He thought of the steps he had taken to reach this place, the hammer against plaster, the crowbar wrenching open the lock, the slow descent into the dark. Each moment had led him here, and now, surrounded by decayed documents and leaking canisters, he wondered if he had trespassed into something that had never been meant for human eyes again. He moved cautiously, the light sweeping across the scattered bundles of papers on the desk. With trembling hands, he lifted another file, its leather cover cracked, stamped with a crest he did not recognize. Inside were handwritten records, contracts bearing signatures long since faded, but still legible enough to betray the outlines of dealings between men of wealth and power. He saw names he did not know, but sensed were significant. Names that carried weight in industries and governments. Notes scrawled in margins hinted at transactions measured not only in money, but in favors, allegiances, and betrayals. Each page was a window into a hidden history, and the deeper he read, the colder he felt. Among the papers lay photographs bound together with twine. He loosened the knot and fanned them out across the dusty desk. Families posed stiffly beside limousines. Men in dark coats shook hands in offices with curtains drawn tight. Soldiers carried crates stamped with symbols he had glimpsed on the corroded canisters. And then there were darker images. Shadows of gatherings where no faces were visible, only outlines against dim light. Figures cloaked in secrecy. Andrew's stomach twisted. This was not simply the legacy of a wealthy man who had feared the Cold War's uncertainty. This was the archive of someone who had thrived in the shadows, who had sought not survival, but control. He replaced the photographs with care, his fingers trembling as he set them down. His mind raced with questions he could not answer. Who had built this vault? What had they hoped to achieve by sealing it away? And why had it been abandoned, left to rot beneath the earth, while the house above crumbled into ruin? He thought of the welded seams on the steel door, the desperation with which someone had tried to ensure it would never be opened again. He thought of his own hand forcing it apart. The realization struck him with sickening clarity. He had undone what another had sacrificed to preserve. Andrew staggered back from the desk, his flashlight beam catching once more on the rows of canisters. The liquid still dripped steadily from the corroded one, spreading its acrid pool wider across the concrete. The stench burned his nostrils, and he knew instinctively that to remain here was to court disaster. He turned toward the corridor, but as he did, the heavy iron grate behind him shifted with a groan, closing an inch as though nudged by an unseen hand. His heart lurched, and for a moment he thought the darkness itself was moving against him. The silence deepened, a suffocating weight that made him want to run. He forced himself forward, climbing back into the main chamber, each step heavy as though the air resisted his escape. He glanced back once, the light catching on the endless shelves and the shadows between them. It looked different now, less like a room and more like a tomb, a place built not to preserve but to imprison. He could almost believe the walls themselves longed to close in again, to hide the secrets that should never have been revealed. By the time he reached the stairway, his breath came in ragged gasps. He clutched the rope against his shoulder, though he had never used it, as though it might anchor him against the pull of the dark. Each step upward seemed steeper than before, and the echoes of dripping water chased him like whispers. His flashlight flickered once, plunging him into darkness long enough to make his heart seize, before flaring back to life. He did not pause. He climbed, one hand against the damp wall, until at last he saw the faint glow of daylight leaking through the gap in the iron door above. Emerging into the great hall was like surfacing from water. The air was still damp and sour, but compared to the vault below, it felt like a blessing. He staggered a few paces, then turned to stare at the gaping door in the wall. It hung ajar, rust flaking from its edges, its lock shattered beyond repair. The darkness behind it seemed deeper than it had before, as if reluctant to release him fully. He stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. He knew without doubt that he could not leave it as it was. That night, back in his room, sleep refused him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the corroded canister dripping steadily onto the floor, the files of names and numbers, the photographs of men whose shadows stretched across decades. He heard again the grinding protest of the steel door, the whisper of the vault as it yielded to him. He understood now why it had been sealed, why someone had entombed it in rust and plaster. It wasn't meant to be seen. It was dangerous, not only for what it contained, but for what it revealed. And he, with his hammer and stubborn will, had set it free. By morning, his decision was clear. He could not shoulder this knowledge alone. He returned to the estate and made the call, his voice steady though his heart raced. He spoke of leaking containers, of documents that bore the weight of hidden history. He did not embellish, but the words themselves were enough. Silence answered him at first, then a calm voice promising that authorities would arrive. When he hung up, a strange release washed through him, though unease clung still. He had passed the burden on, but he knew it would never leave him completely. The first vehicles came before noon, police cars, then unmarked vans carrying men in protective suits. They worked quickly, cordoning off the garden, approaching the open door with equipment and lights. Andrew stood apart, forgotten in the shadows of the hall as they descended. For hours their muffled voices rose and fell, their shadows flickering against the stairwell. When at last they emerged, their faces hidden behind masks, their words confirmed what he already knew. The place was dangerous, not only the chemical canisters, but the documents, the photographs, the tapes. More came as the day stretched into evening. Military trucks rumbling into the grounds, bomb disposal units with their grim precision. Each box and container was lifted with care, sealed away in armored vehicles. The leaking canister was carried out layered in protection, glistening under harsh lights. Andrew watched in silence, his machete forgotten in the grass outside. The estate buzzed with energy, a hive of movement around the open door that gaped like a wound in the wall. Historians and government men arrived too, their suits crisp, their notebooks always ready. They spread papers on temporary tables, whispering urgently to one another. Andrew caught fragments. Funding, foreign operations, influence. Their language was careful, clinical, but he felt the weight of their words. What he had uncovered was no simple cache. It was a window into a shadow world, a record of power and corruption preserved beneath the earth. As night fell, the mansion glowed under floodlights. Men moved like ants, carrying crates, photographing documents, sealing evidence. Reporters gathered at the gates, their cameras flashing, their voices calling for the gardener who had unearthed secrets older than himself. Andrew did not step forward. He lingered at the edge of the garden, watching the activity as if it belonged to another life. To them, he was already a symbol. A simple man who had peeled back the ivy of time to reveal hidden machinery. But inside, he felt no triumph, only the same dread that had filled him when the air of the vault first touched his lungs. When he finally turned away, the mansion loomed behind him, its boarded windows glowing in the artificial light like blind eyes. The gate clanged shut as he passed, and the gravel crunched beneath his boots. He did not look back, but he knew with a certainty that chilled his bones. The shadow of what he had uncovered would follow him always. He had not simply opened a door. He had stepped into its secret, and secrets of that weight never let go. Andrew Hale walked on into the night, carrying the truth like a burden he could never set down. And though he longed for the simplicity of soil and stone, he knew he had crossed a threshold that could never be crossed back. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories waiting for you. And be sure to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself,